main reasons that we go to the cinema is to escape from the mundanities and frustrations of everyday life. And perhaps the single most satisfying way in which conventional Hollywood differs from the real world is this. When someone does something bad, they bloody well get punished for it. In the real world, people get away with awful behaviour all the time. In many films, however, specifically the more conventional Hollywood-esque ones, bad characters get punished for their transgressions. And you love to see it. And when you're expecting comeuppance for a villainous character and it never arrives, that is nothing short of infuriating. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, and let's take a look at these movie characters who never got the comeuppance they deserved. Starting with Pinocchio, Honest John. Disney animations have always soared high on their fairy tale appeal. These are stories where good triumphs over evil, and the villains of the story get their just desserts by the end. At least that's normally how it goes. Disney's sophomore feature Pinocchio subverted expectations here, as its most noteworthy villain doesn't get any sort of punishment. Well, Monstro the whale is defeated by Pinocchio at the end, but Monstro only appears in the final stretch. Throughout the rest of the story, the main villain is the fox Honest John, who leads Pinocchio astray not once but twice. He is perhaps the greatest test of Pinocchio's conscience throughout much of the film, and one could reasonably expect there to be some sort of final confrontation where Pinocchio finally learns to resist temptation. But no, not at all. After tricking Pinocchio into boarding a coach that takes him to that strange island where boys are turned into donkeys, Honest John disappears from the movie altogether and is never referred to again. Apparently, there were going to be scenes depicting John and his accomplice Gideon being captured by the police, but these were ultimately cut, which was arguably to the film's detriment. For all of the movie's considerable strengths, it doesn't have the sturdiest of plots, and adding more of a payoff to Honest John's story would have gone some way in remedying this. Atonement, Briony. Just before we start, this is one of my favourite films, just FYI. Okay, yes, sure, Briony did feel great regret for her terrible actions as a child, but let's be honest. Does that actually change anything? In the opening scenes of Atonement, young Briony becomes jealous of her older sister Cecilia, who has a romance with Robbie, the gardener at their family's lavish country estate. She's angry because she has a crush on Robbie, and when her cousin is assaulted on the estate, Briony spitefully implicates Robbie. Thanks to this false accusation, Robbie is imprisoned, then sent off to war, and he ultimately dies of septicemia during the evacuation of Dunkirk, while Cecilia dies in the bombing of Balham Tube Station. As for the real attacker, Paul Marshall, well, he ends up marrying his own victim so that she can never testify, and he ultimately gets away with everything. In the end, an elderly Briony reveals that her final novel rewrites the story with a happy ending, imagining Robbie and Cecilia having a life together as they should have done. Again, Briony is deeply remorseful, but the bottom line is that she got to live a long, full life as a successful author. Meanwhile, she got Robbie killed, she destroyed the life of her sister, and allowed a sick predator to get away with everything and further torment her cousin. Why? All because of her childish jealousy. In hindsight, describing the film like that, people might question why it's my favourite film, but I'll tell you why it's my favourite film for one scene. The incredible long shot on Dunkirk Beach. It is one of the most beautiful scenes I've ever seen on film, and that is why it's my favourite film. Project X, Coaster. Project X, a found footage flick depicting the craziest house party imaginable, was panned by critics, and it's certainly not high art. But its OTT vision of debauchery provides some modest entertainment. Nevertheless, one huge problem with it is that there is one unbearable character who, frustratingly, never faces any consequences for being a douchebag, and that's Coaster, the repellent friend of the party's host. With his annoying voice and endlessly obnoxious demeanour, Coaster is like a nasty wasp buzzing angrily in your ear every second he's on screen. And to make matters worse, his treatment of women makes him seem like a sex pest in the making, and it would have been great if the movie had given him any sort of punishment for his toxic behaviour. But no, Project X ends with Coaster sexually harassing a female reporter and promising that another party is coming, indicating that he hasn't learned anything or grown from the party. If anything, it seems to have emboldened him and made him even bloody worse than before, which is really saying something. The Harry Potter franchise Peter Pettigrew. The Harry Potter series was always great at punishing its villains, and Peter Pettigrew is one of the most hated of them all. Lest we forget, this is the guy who sold out Harry's parents to Voldemort, and the great Timothy Spall played him to loathsome, snivelling perfection. In fact, the movie's version of the character is even nastier than the one in the books, thanks to Spall playing him as a more sinister character. As such, viewers would have been looking forward to seeing a satisfying end to this character, except that satisfying end never came. Pettigrew is last seen being knocked out by Dobby the House Elf in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, and he is never seen or referenced again. Now in the book, an artificial hand gifted to him by Voldemort strangles Pettigrew to death when he shows mercy to Harry. But this was cut for being too graphic for the films. Well, that's all well and good, but they needed to give this character some sort of ending rather than leaving that plot thread unresolved in such an infuriating way. Jurassic Park franchise, Dr. Henry Wu. Dr. Henry Wu, a scientist in the original Jurassic Park, was the only legacy character to feature in 2015's Jurassic World, and he recurred throughout the ill-fated trilogy, which made billions, but got worse and worse with each installment. The whole time, he was a secondary villain creating weaponized dinosaurs for various corrupt companies. He was also the brains behind those giant locusts that dominated Jurassic World Dominion. While B.D. Wong himself has described the character as misunderstood, that's really being a bit too generous. He's not a good guy, and though 2022's disastrous Dominion tried to give Wu a redemption, much like everything else in that sequel, this didn't land at all. He cures the giant locust outbreak, but let's not forget that he was the one who started it in the first place. Following this unearned redemption, Wu has not been seen since, and he didn't even return in the franchise's most recent installment, Jurassic World Rebirth, which was thankfully better than the other sequels. Presumably, he's still a free man. How unjust. Cinderella, the Stepmother and Stepsisters. Honest John disappearing from Pinocchio was distracting enough, but this example is considerably worse. Cinderella, as visually and orally stunning as it undeniably is, does suffer from a poorly constructed narrative, with the pacing being all over the place. Many characters are underdeveloped, especially the prince, while Cinderella's horrible family, Lady Tremaine and the ugly stepsisters, never get any resolution. At the film's close, Lady Tremaine locks Cinderella in the attic to keep her from the prince, but Cinderella escapes with the help of some mice. Once she does, the film jumps straight to her wedding, and it's not explained what happened to her vile family. In the original Grimm's version of the story, the stepsisters do get their comeuppance. The fairy godmother is replaced by a magic tree in that version, and the doves from this tree gouge out the stepsisters' eyes at Cinderella's wedding. Well, as it should hopefully go without saying, that definitely wouldn't have been suitable here. Still, some sort of payback would have been nice. After all, plenty of other fairy tales adapted by Disney have had dark endings for their villains, which Disney successfully toned down in their films. For example, in the original version of Snow White, the evil queen is made to dance in hot lead shoes until she dies. At the very least, having some sort of final conversation where Cinderella chastises or even forgives her relatives would have gone down nicely. Law-abiding citizen, Nick Rice. Law-abiding citizen is too plot-hole-ridden to take seriously, but it is modestly entertaining all the same, largely thanks to its engagingly gritty, go-for-broke tone. It has been quite a cult favourite over the years, but many have taken issue with the movie's ending. In this particular case, that's understandable. In this story, former CIA assassin Clyde Shelton enacts a ridiculously brutal campaign of revenge against the Justice Department that gave his family's killers a pitifully light sentence. His targets include Nick Rice, the lawyer who handled the original case. Now, in fairness, Nick was unable to go all the way with a conviction due to mishandled evidence. And he isn't a horrible person or anything, so this isn't to say that he deserved to be killed by Clyde. Rather, the movie arguably should have shown him learning something from his mistakes. Clyde's actions were unmistakably wrong, but he made a few good points about the unfairness of the system that Nick was a part of. Instead, Nick defeats Clyde and at the end seems all set to continue perpetuating the status quo, which was quite the off-putting ending. Neighbours 2, Sorority Rising, the Sorority Girls. 2014's Bad Neighbours, which saw a married couple warring with their obnoxious frat boy neighbours, wasn't very good, but at the very least it offered a satisfying resolution. The frat boys behaved appallingly and got punished for it, as they deserved to be. 2016's sequel, however, went in the opposite direction in a grossly insulting way. This time, Mac and Kelly, as well as their former nemesis Teddy, are up against a sorority that has moved in next door. These young women are absolute scum. Mac and Kelly ask them to keep the noise down so that they don't scare a potential house buyer away, but they refuse to do that, and when Mac and Kelly call the girls' parents in desperation, they decide to launch a pranking war. The girls deliberately keep their neighbours awake at night for hours. They break into their house and steal lots of things. They hack their phones to trick Mac into going to Australia, and they even throw used tampons at the house, one of which Mac and Kelly's young child gets a hold of. Quite frankly, these girls should have ended up in juvie, but no, they got no punishment for their disgusting behaviour whatsoever. In fact, Mac and Kelly decide to let them off the hook when they overhear some of the girls complaining about how they live in a sexist world. Pretty disgusting. Chicken Little, Buck Cluck. Chicken Little is quite arguably the worst Disney animation ever. Not only is it visually gross and painfully unfunny, but it's also let down by just how repellently mean-spirited it all is. A kid named Chicken Little mistakenly believes the sky is falling, and his entire town proceeds to mock and bully him for an entire year. And the most depressing thing of all? The kid's own father, Buck Cluck, also treats him like garbage and doesn't make any effort to hide how embarrassed he is by his own kid. In fact, at the beginning, Buck even seems to encourage the town's mockery of his own son, to an extent. A big part of the movie is Chicken Little taking up baseball in a desperate attempt to make his father like him again. I mean, what the hell is this? And worst of all, the movie eventually puts Buck Cluck through a wholly unearned redemption. He does get a scene where he apologizes to his son, but it's as poorly written as everything else in the film. Furthermore, throughout the remainder of the picture, Buck makes several jokes about bad parenting, so that apology doesn't really feel sincere. Kick-Ass 2, Todd. Kick-Ass 2 features one of the worst endings in recent memory. One with so many disturbing consequences and implications that never get properly addressed. It's difficult to imagine how a third Kick-Ass would have carried things on from this, and one of the grimmest things of all is that Kick-Ass/Dave is still mates with the guy who got his dad murdered. Dave's friend Todd has a rather petty squabble with Dave and fellow friend Marty. When he learns they're both superheroes, Todd tries to create his own alter ego, but storms off when they laugh at him. He then goes to join the team led by this movie's main antagonist and thoughtlessly tells them that the man in prison for being Kick-Ass is actually Dave's father, who's then cruelly murdered in jail. Okay, fine, Todd didn't realise that this team was a group of murderers, but even so, why on earth would he reveal Kick-Ass's identity to anyone? If he'd had a semblance of basic decency or common sense, he'd have realised that this was putting Dave in danger, and Dave laughing at him is no excuse for betraying him like this. Rather jarringly, neither Dave nor anyone else ever learns of Todd's betrayal, and there are never any consequences for his selfishness. Dark Shadows, Barnabas Collins. Dark Shadows is one of the lower points of Tim Burton's career, thanks in no small part to how weirdly nasty the entire thing is. Burton's earlier films were able to mix light and dark really well, but this one is just cruel more than anything else, and it never seems to have any self-awareness of just how nasty a lot of its story actually is. Nearly everyone in this movie is unlikable, including, most damagingly, Dark Shadows' vampire protagonist Barnabas Collins. He murders at least 20 innocent people for food throughout the film, and never gets any punishment for it whatsoever. Well, his initial feeding on the workman, who unintentionally set him free, seemed like a moment of thirst-driven madness, but he later dispatches a crowd of hippies and is totally aware of what he's doing. Though Barnabas expresses regret for these deaths, there's never any sort of proper retribution for it, and jarringly, the movie continues to present him as the good guy. He actually gets a happy ending, and is presumably allowed to live in freedom with Victoria, his love interest. Well, I think the families of all those people he butchered might have a thing or two to say about that. The Host, Those in Charge. Many monster movies feature mankind's folly creating the monster. And The Host, one of the all-time great monster movies, is no different. A typically rich work from director Bong Joon-ho, The Host uses the authorities' appalling handling of the crisis to deliver some stinging, cynical social commentary. The film's monster is created by chemicals being dumped into Seoul's Han River, which eventually mutates the wildlife. This is done at the instruction of an American pathologist, and years later, the American and Korean militaries screw everyone over. In order to cover up the fact that Americans are directly responsible for the crisis, they pretend the creature carries a virus and use this to place harsh restrictions on those who have come into contact with the creature. Hell, they even try to lobotomize the movie's protagonist in order to prevent the truth from coming to light. Eventually, the creature is defeated by several members of the public, but the higher-ups successfully hide the truth about its origins and never face any sort of repercussions. A frustrating outcome then, but also one that's tragically believable. 12 Years a Slave, Solomon's Kidnappers. As I said earlier, when we go to the cinema, we love to see the villains get their just desserts. One of the reasons for this is that it distracts us from a sad, inescapable truth. In real life, bad people don't always get what they deserve. Sometimes, they get away scot-free. Now, 12 Years a Slave is based on a true story, and that's exactly the case here. At the start of 12 Years a Slave, two men approach Solomon Northup, a free black man and violinist living in New York. He's approached by two white men who offer him a new short-term position as a musician in Washington, D.C. But it's all a cover. At dinner, these insidious sickos drug Solomon and then sell him off into slavery. It's 12 years before he's finally freed. As the movie's closing titles relate, Solomon tried to get these kidnappers charged, but the court case dragged out for 2 years and was eventually dropped altogether. He also tried to charge the man that he was sold to, but back then black people weren't allowed to testify in court in Washington, D.C., so that man was ultimately acquitted. This is a final cruel detail that makes an already harrowing film even more gut-wrenching. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Grandpa Joe. Yes, okay, this one is low-hanging fruit, but oh well. Grandpa Joe is a massive hypocrite. He calls Willy Wonka a crook, when he'd clearly been faking being bedridden for 20 years instead of helping his impoverished family to earn money. I mean, he suddenly did a big dance when Charlie won the golden ticket, and he'd obviously been sneaking off before that. Otherwise, how else did he buy chocolate for Charlie earlier on? Joe chastises the rotten kids for their behaviour. He's abrupt and rude to most of the other characters, and he steals fizzy lifting drinks from Wonka and involves Charlie in it as well. At the end, Wonka tells Joe that due to their thievery, he and Charlie won't get the prize of a lifetime supply of chocolate. And an unrepentant Joe goes into a rant vowing to get even. He intends to give one of Wonka's everlasting gobstoppers to Slugworth, Wonka's rival, who'd approached Charlie and all the other kids. A remorseful Charlie gives the gobstopper back, and he passes the test Wonka had set for him, thus allowing him to inherit the chocolate factory. Grandpa Joe nearly ruined everything for his grandson. All those rotten kids got their just desserts, but nothing for Grandpa Joe. What a pity. Dear Evan Hansen, Evan Hansen. Evan Hansen was quite possibly a psychopath. Okay, fine, he's dealing with his own mental health issues, just like pretty much every single teenager in the world is at any given time. That's not an excuse for what he does. After a fellow student commits suicide, his family mistakenly believes that he and Evan were friends, and Evan proceeds to fake an entire friendship with the dead boy just to get close to his sister Zoe, who Evan fancies. Eventually, his deception is exposed. And what happens to Evan? Nothing much. The bereaved family is understandably pissed off, but that's about it. The original stage musical was criticised by some reviewers for not punishing Evan enough, and the disastrous 2021 film took this even further. Most damagingly, it omitted the song Good For You, which chastises Evan and doesn't seem to pass any of the judgment that Evan sorely deserved. The movie version of Evan is egregiously off-putting. Ben Platt was far too old for the part, and the abysmal makeup job to try and make him look younger was a total eyesore. This, combined with his despicable actions, made him an uncomfortable character to watch. And although giving him some sort of comeuppance wouldn't have saved this generally misjudged film, it might have made it easier to get through. The Green Inferno, Alejandro. This case was not only infuriating, but downright inexplicable. In many types of horror movies, you can usually expect the most detestable character of the group to bite the dust as catharsis for the audience. And that's certainly what you'd have expected from The Green Inferno, Eli Roth's schlocky tribute to cannibal horror films. In this one, a group of well-intentioned but idiotic student activists led by Alejandro go to the Amazon to stage a protest. But after their plane crashes, they're captured by a tribe of cannibals. Now, even in a movie where most of the characters are quite irritating, Alejandro stands out as monstrously unlikable. First up, he reveals that the protest was a sham to benefit a rival petrochemical company run by his father. And throughout his ordeal, he shows a psychopathic disregard for the well-being of his fellow captives. In fact, he even prevents one of them from escaping at one point so that he won't be alone. And that man is then eaten alive. Still, that's what's going to happen to Alejandro, right? Nope. He doesn't escape, but as shown through a credit scene, Alejandro remains alive in the jungle and has even joined the tribe. What the hell? Even by Eli Roth standards, The Green Inferno was an excessively sadistic movie, and giving viewers the catharsis of Alejandro's death would have made it easier to digest. Letting him live was subversion of the most insulting kind. Trading Places, Penelope Witherspoon. Although some of its jokes haven't aged so well, Trading Places is still a delightful comedy classic to this day. In it, a wealthy young banker named Lewis Winthorpe and a homeless hustler named Billy Valentine trade places as part of a complicated bet, in order to determine how well they'll function in different social circumstances. One of the great things about Trading Places is that it really gives the antagonist their just desserts. The central bet is organised by Randolph and Mortimer Duke, two of the most entertainingly hateful comedy villains ever. They get wonderful comeuppance as Winthorpe and Valentine bankrupt them, while their murderous hitman, Clarence Beeks, is left caged up with a gorilla being shipped to Africa. Nevertheless, there's another unpleasant character the film unfortunately forgets, and that's Penelope Witherspoon, the grandniece of the Dukes, who's engaged to Winthorpe at the start of the film. She cruelly rejects and dumps him when circumstances change, showing she's just as shallow and selfish as her great-uncles are. She ultimately disappears from the movie, and this has always felt like a missed opportunity. By the end, Winthorpe has begun a romance with a prostitute named Ophelia, but it would have been great if she tried to get Lewis to take her back once he became rich again, only to be rejected. Or something like that. Chinatown, Noah Cross. This one still stings 50 years later. This particular example isn't annoying, it's outright harrowing. Chinatown's Noah Cross is one of the most despicable movie characters of them all. A wealthy industrialist and crime lord, he is eventually proven through protagonist Jake Gittes' investigation to have committed or facilitated multiple murders in his ruthless quest to gain control of the Los Angeles water supply. It gets even worse though. Cross has also been sexually abusing his own daughter, Evelyn, who has given birth to his daughter/granddaughter. Yikes. Cross is a repugnant bastard. And while many films would have been kind enough to grant audiences the catharsis of seeing this sicko get his just desserts, Chinatown goes down a much darker route, one which has secured the movie a place in cinematic infamy. By the end, all of Cross's schemes have succeeded. He's covered up his involvement, and he's even taken his granddaughter away from Gittes, while Evelyn dies in a police shootout. A numb, heartbroken Gittes is led away from the scene, and one of the other police officers says, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown." This was just devastating, not least because it's scarily believable. Even now, powerful people are constantly getting away with terrible crimes. Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Ferris Bueller. Okay, this one's going to be controversial, but it shouldn't be. The sole reason why people like the character of Ferris Bueller is because of Matthew Broderick's undeniably fantastic performance. When you look deeper, Ferris Bueller is an arrogant, lazy, shallow, spoilt brat who, come to think of it, might be a psychopath. After all, he's a pathological liar who manipulates everyone else, including his vulnerable, depressed best friend Cameron. Late in the film, Cameron has a full-on mental breakdown, and Ferris is largely to blame for this. It is scarily easy to imagine a different version of the story with Ferris Bueller as the villain. A Machiavellian schemer a la Frank Underwood or Shakespeare's Iago, who manipulates everyone to destroy their lives and better his own. It is also easy to imagine Ferris Bueller becoming an out-and-out villain further down the line. As for the so-called antagonist of this movie, it's Dean of Students Edward Rooney, who was coming after Bueller for his persistent truancy. His only crime was doing his bloody job. A better film would have allowed Ferris to either face a punishment or at the very least learn something. But no, he gets away with his shameless truanting and he's probably just going to do it all again. That's the key thing that makes this comedy classic so grossly overrated. And if anyone refers to this character as a hero, then they are simply wrong. And finally, It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Potter. It's time to talk about one of the most emotionally affecting, heartfelt movies of them all. It's a Wonderful Life is the Christmas movie to end them all. An inspirational slice of cinematic joy that'll leave entire cinemas in floods of tears. Still, every classic has a flaw or two, such is the nature of any piece of art. And here is the biggest one with It's a Wonderful Life. Where was the comeuppance for Mr. Potter? Mr. Potter is the insidiously vile villain of the piece, a greedy banker who repeatedly tries to destroy the town of Bedford Falls and ruin the life of George Bailey, a good man who spends his time trying to protect the townsfolk from Mr. Potter. During the film's legendary third act, an angel shows a now suicidal George what the world would be like if he'd never existed. And it turns out Mr. Potter took over the town and turned it into a vision of genuine hell. Thanks in no small part to Lionel Barrymore's skin-crawling performance, Potter is one of those purely hateable characters who everyone detested. So it does suck that he never gets his just desserts. He's only shown very briefly when George returns to the present. And as beautiful as the movie's ending is, the total absence of any punishment for this odious scumbag has always been distracting.